Hey guys, it's Jordan here, and today I'm back with another video. And in today's interesting, we're going to be asking ourselves, is morality objective or relational? Now, before I begin, I'd like to speak in regards to the mind frame behind this video. What wanted me to make this video in the first place came after a small debate I had with my older brother on this matter, because I was reciting the narrative of Nemesis, which I've been working on for quite some time. Now, I'll speak in regards to the sequel, right? I spoke in regards to the sequel of Nemesis, but here and there I would mention the events of the previous installment going into this one. Now, because he lacked the full context of the previous installment, just hearing bits and pieces of it, he formed an opinion, judging the story by surface value. He didn't know the deeper, the deeper reasons behind why people made the choices they made. He just heard that they made certain choices. So he wrote off some characters as immoral, and that really had me thinking. So I wanted to extensively talk in regards to this because that begs the question: is morality relational or is it objective? Now, to me, it made a lot of sense of why the people made the decisions they made, because of course I know the context, and I'm sure you do if you're familiar with the previous videos on it. But on surface value, they made a lot of questionable and, dare I say, bad decisions. But no one's asking you to always agree with what the characters are doing, because there are many elements and areas where characters don't even agree with each other. So that being said, let's get straight into this video. Now, I'm gonna we're gonna ask ourselves, what is the biggest religion in the world? I'm asking this on Google. Christianity is the biggest religion in the world. Um, its followers in terms of billion is 2,300,000,000 followers. That is a lot of people. Under Christianity is Islam. This has purely 2 billion followers. And of course, there are other religions. These are Eastern Indian religions, being Hinduism and Buddhism. Hinduism has 1 billion followers and 200 million. And of course, Buddhism doesn't necessarily have a billion followers, but it has 300 million. Now, of course, Christianity derives from Christ, and that is, of course, Jesus Christ. So, so we're going to ask, if many people in terms of religion take their moral ideas from Christianity, right? We got to ask ourselves, what did Jesus Christ say about morality? We're going to the Gospel of Matthew, namely the 22nd chapter, and Jesus asked a question, and this is Jesus's response. All right, let's look here. Uh, Matthew chapter 22, verse 35. One of them, an expert in the law, tested him with this question: Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like unto it: love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. Now, I have much to say about that. Now, first and foremost, you got to understand the cultural traditions of the time, right? The cultural tradition at the time, you can understand here, the man who asked him in verse 35 was an expert in the law, not just the social law of the time, as in the political law, because this was written during the rule of the Roman Empire. He wasn't talking about Roman law, but he was talking about the cultural law that governed the Jewish people, right? And the law that governed the Jewish people was the law of Moses. This is why Jesus says in verse 40, all the law and the prophets hang on these commandments. Now, let's talk about his response, about the answer itself. He says, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. So that to an extent can be considered vague because you understand love is not intellect. Love is a emotion. So Jesus responds to morality about you have to apply yourself emotionally to something. Now, he separates these commandments. He says in verse 39, and the second is like unto it, love your neighbor as yourself. So there are two commandments. There's a commandment to love God, because bear in mind, these two are the greatest commandments, right? Love God and then love your neighbor. Now, as much as we may want to continue, I want to give some previous context. We're going to go several chapters back to Matthew chapter 5. Now, look here. Verse 43 of Matthew chapter 5. You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be the children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. So, Jesus says, in terms of loving God and loving your neighbor, these two commandments are essentially what the entirety of the law of Moses is about. But Jesus' own addition, which was in Matthew chapter 5, is that you should even go beyond the second commandment. Of course, love your God, right, and love your neighbor. But what about a third component? What about loving your enemies? So Jesus' framework, right? Jesus establishes that morality is only powerful in love, right? He establishes that morality is just a matter of love, really, because love dictates your actions. So he wants people to apply themselves emotionally to things, because so that shows that morality is not a matter of intelligence. Morality is simply a matter of helping people in any way that you know. So that is the moral philosophy of Christianity. That is the moral teaching of Jesus Christ, that you love God, love your neighbor, and also love your enemy. So just love. If we were to simplify what you're saying, simplify the simplification, right? Jesus saying love everyone. So that's Jesus's approach, and that's is what is found in Christianity. So let's talk about certain scenarios, because he said the first commandment, because remember, he gave an order to it. The first commandment is to love God. But what about people? Let's give scenarios. What about people who are isolated, that don't live amongst people? What about people who live in the wilderness, the desert? What about those individuals? Well, the answer is given for those individuals. That even if you don't have a neighbor, which you don't have anyone you're with, or even an enemy, you are to just love God. Because God is not, this commandment to love God is not relational. Let's even look at that. Define relational. Concerning the way in which two or more people or things are connected. So if you're not connected to people, then you are still under the first commandment, which is to love God. Now, if we were to go to Acts chapter 17, here comes the Apostle Paul. Because he talks about God here in verse 22. Look at this. Paul stood up, and also I would add that Paul is a follower of Jesus Christ, so that you have the previous context going into this. All right, that being said, let's continue. Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, "People of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship. And this is what I am going to proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by human hands. And he's not served by human hands, as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. From one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us." So I want to stop there at verse 27. So God is not far from any of them, right? And we have the previous context. Paul is in the land of Athens, and he sees the Athens or the Athenians, right, worshiping a god that they don't even know about. So now that we have discussed that, we see that not everyone, based on this example with the evangelists coming to preach, that not everyone has knowledge of God. So this is why I brought up the law of Moses, because cultural factors matter a lot. The Greeks here, because that's who the Athenians were, they were in the land of Greece, right? They did not have the cultural idea of God that that the Jews had. So to give the broad commandment, right? Because he says this is the greatest commandment, to love God and your neighbor and your enemy. We must answer more about question number one, or rather the first commandment. Who is God? That's the question, because it's very vague, right? We looked at the religions of the world. Just because Christianity has a majority does not mean Christianity has everyone. Because if the idea of God was not vague, there would not be other religions such as Hinduism, Islam, uh, Buddhism. These religions exist because not everyone knows the framework the Jews live by, or not everyone believes the framework that the Jews live by, because that's who Jesus was sent to. Jesus gave the answers to the question that the lawyer asked according to the law of Moses. He said, "On these two commandments hang the law and the prophets." So he showed that his morality comes from the law of Moses. But Paul here is preaching to Greeks who don't really have that, they don't have that reference, because the law of Moses was a law for the Jews. These people have a different understanding of God. They have a different understanding of the law of God. They have a different understanding of morality, or what it means to be right entirely. But I want to give the solution to this question. How do we answer number one? Well, Paul here says in verse 27, though he is not far from any one of us. So that means God God is near. So that means that the first commandment to love God is actually very possible. The second commandment is relational because some people are in prison. There are many instances where people are isolated. There are many instances where people are indeed loners. I'm going to have a small phone call real quick. Okay, I'm back and resuming where I left off. But according to Paul here, it's impossible for someone to be alienated from God. He says here once again, though he's not far from any one of us. He continues on to verse 28. For in him we live and move and have our being. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. Therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by human design and skill. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent, for he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. Now, he's, of course, speaking in regards to Jesus Christ, but nevertheless, the Apostle Paul here shows that it is impossible for someone to truly be alienated from God because he says, in God, we move and we live and we have breath. All of these things come from God. So, this means that God is not necessarily a relational force, but I'm going to still continue on that because I don't want anyone to get the wrong idea. What I mean by relational, I mean it in the sense that even if you don't have a personal relationship with God, you are in a way still connected to God. But nevertheless, you need a relationship. When I say alienated, I mean it alienated in the sense that you cannot know God. So if someone doesn't know God, it's through, as in the case of the Athenians, it's either through one, ignorance, or it is from two, willful choice. Those are the two ways that someone cannot know God, through ignorance and through willful choice. But Paul did give them credit because they were searching for God. He says that they had an altar dedicated to the unknown God. So they were on their attempt to find God, and they were trying to know God through their own culture. Here we have more instances of ignorance happening. Acts chapter 14. It's not in Athens, but in Lycaonia. Verse 11. When the crowd saw what Paul had done, they shouted in the Lycaonian language, "The gods have come down to us in human form." Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul they called Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. The priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city, brought bowls and wreaths to the city gates because he and the crowd wanted to offer sacrifices to them. But when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of this, they tore their clothes and rushed out into the crowd shouting, "Friends, why are you doing this? We too are only human like you. We are bringing you good news, telling you to turn from these worthless things to the living God, who made the heavens and the earth and the sea and everything in them. In the past, he let all nations go their own way. Yet he has not left himself without testimony. He has shown kindness by giving you rain from heaven and crops in their seasons. He provides you with plenty of food and fills your hearts with joy, even with these words." They had difficulty keeping the crowd from sacrificing to them. So, They were no longer inherently ignorant anymore because Paul told them the truth, but their culture, nevertheless, their understanding of God was still ingrained into their mind, was still heavily imprinted on their mind. So, but of what Paul had said, him being a foreigner, of course, it didn't really resonate with them. So they continued to sacrifice because that was the Greek understanding of God. The Athenians didn't have a good idea of who God was, nor the Lycaonians, right? And I'm bringing these examples because, the understanding of God came from the Jews, right? Jesus was a Jew. Jesus was teaching the Jews of his time about God. So even the Jews did not even have a full understanding of God. They had God's law, but for the most part, their culture influenced how they thought and saw the world, right? Because even then, an expert in the law asked Jesus, "What is the greatest commandment?" Unless this is a rhetorical question, that means he was genuinely seeking for understanding. So that means the complete understanding was not necessarily in the Jews, only partial understanding through the law and the prophets, through their holy texts. They had minimal understanding of God, maybe more than the Greeks did, because the Greeks didn't even have any of these point of reference, right? But even then, their culture made them think God was a certain way, just as the Greek culture made the Greeks think God was a certain way. In their case, they thought gods were multiple, right? There was a god Hermes, giving an example. Uh they thought Paul was Zeus, and they thought Hermes was Barnabas. Or am I getting it wrong? Let's see here. It was the other way around. They thought Barnabas was Zeus, that's one god. They thought Paul was Hermes. So, based on those examples given there, they had an understanding there were multiple gods, while the Jews understood that there was one God. But understanding that God is one is not necessarily enough to know God because they didn't have a personal relationship with God. So they didn't know what God thought or how he was. They only had just what he wanted them to do, which was the commandments. And we already established that loving God is vague when you don't know who God is, and loving your neighbor and your enemies, that's dependent on if you live amongst people. Because there are things known as, of course, loners. There are things, of course, known as hermits. And some individuals go as far as to make the second commandment of none effect so that they can better fulfill the first commandment. These individuals are known as ascetics. These individuals are known as monks, where they walk away from human communion altogether to worship God in isolation or amongst their small community. This was prominent when people were becoming very, I want to say, disillusioned, very disappointed with the social life. So they thought, let me dedicate more time to God while removing time from people so I can fully get an understanding of who God is. Right? This is similar to what Jesus had done when he was in the wilderness for 40 days. All right? But they go for longer periods than that and they remain in those conditions. Am I saying that they don't interact with people at all? No, they definitely do interact with people. But they spend their time mostly with God, right? Um, and to prove that the Jews didn't have full understanding with God aside from them just, asking Jesus questions. I want to go to Acts chapter 9 because we talk much of Paul teaching the Greeks on who God was, him being a Jew, of course. Before then, like the lawyer who was still searching for the truth, Paul at one point likewise was searching for the truth. But before I go there, I want to go to the Gospel of Mark. Now we know Jesus' response to the expert in the law. It was that love God, love your neighbor, right? But according to the Gospel of Mark, if we go to the Gospel of Mark, he asks a different. The question overall is the same, but he has another answer to it with a little bit more detail than the account given in Matthew. So let's go there, shall we? This is found in Mark chapter 12. All right, Mark chapter 12, verse 28. One of the teachers of the law came and heard them debating. Noticing that Jesus had given them a good answer, he asked him, of all the commandments, which is the most important? The most important one, answered Jesus, is this: Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. So Jesus says that God is one. And then he gives a response that was in the other account. Verse 30. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. The second is this: love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these. So let's go back to verse 29. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the